So we need to turn our attention now to the end of Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to be in verse 36 to begin as we move, finishing chapter 11 and into chapter 12. When we ended Hebrews 11 2 weeks ago, what we saw was a list of characters, some of whom were explained, some of whom were, commentated on. In particular, we started with Abel, moved then to Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and several others as well, ending with Rahab. And then we sort of got the machine gun approach, which is what it seems to read like when you see name after name after name after name after name. You know, the author says, time will fail me if I should talk of someone like Samson or Jephthah or Samuel, I believe, is included in the list. I'd have to go back and look at the actual list. But just over and over and over again, name after name after name. And we ended that section around verse 34 and 35 talking about the positive things that come as a result of living by faith. So, for example, you live by faith, you can conquer kingdoms. And we saw how that lines up with some of the kings that are addressed in Hebrews chapter 11. And even some of the prophets and some of the judges. If you live by faith, you can quench fires. You know, that refers to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You live by faith, you can boldly approach the king and be defiant to the political powers that be. We think about Daniel and Esther and other heroes of faith of that sort. So when we get to verse 34 and 35, things are really good for those who live by faith. And as readers of the text, we think, man, this is great. You know, I can live by faith and I can do all these powerful things. And every sermon I've ever heard on Hebrews 11 always ends right there, right? This is the good part of living by faith. The problem is that's not where the text ends. And the text ends in a rather depressive way, just to be completely fair. So verse 36 through 38 says, and others, talking about others in the list of the Hall of Faith, and others experienced mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawed apart, murdered with the sword, and they went out in sheepskins and goat skins. They were destitute, afflicted, and ill-treated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and caves and openings in the earth. Now, the question that jumps to my mind, and maybe jumps to yours, is who in the world is this talking about? And how narrow of a perspective should we have with these descriptions? So we could go through this list again, this list of descriptions, and find individual figures who fit that particular description. But I think the author here is transitioning to speak more broadly, that while these may apply individually to those that we are familiar with from the Old Testament, I think he's showing here that this is a roundabout way to talk about how even though you live by faith, bad things can still happen to you. That's something that Christians don't want to hear. Case in point. This time next week, we will have elected a new leader. And Christians all over this country are praying for and perhaps worried about what that's going to be like. And you should be praying about it. We all should. But why are Christians so inclined to perhaps panic about these things? My hypothesis is it's because being a Christian in America for a long time has been relatively simple. It's been relatively comfortable and relatively easy. And we don't want it to be any other way. And we can talk about the rights we have to practice our faith the way that we want to and all that, but I don't want to talk about that tonight. That's another conversation for another time. The reality is that as time progresses, regardless of who is in leadership, it is going to be much more difficult to be a Christian eventually. And I'm not saying that from a political perspective. I'm saying that because I know the New Testament. We don't know when the Lord is going to come back. Jesus himself even says he doesn't know. And if he doesn't know, then I sure as goodness am not going to say that I know. But here's what I do know. I know that the Bible is pretty clear that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets a lot better. The Bible's clear about that. So when the author here talks about those who live by faith and yet their lives didn't work out exactly the way victoriously as the others did, well, what are we to take from that? Some experienced mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. I think particularly here about the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet. He weeps over the city of Jerusalem, and perhaps the author who wrote the book of Lamentations. But Jeremiah ticked off so many people that they threw him in an empty well. I mean, think about that. They threw him in an empty well and left him to die. And then they eventually came and drug him back out. But they really, really mistreated him. He spent time in prison. Other prophets did as well. Chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. You know, you could be stoned for being a blasphemer. And stoning occurred in two different ways. One was stoning to kill. The other was stoning to run you out of town, like throwing rocks at you to run you out of town. That's how Paul, when Paul refers to being stoned, obviously Paul didn't die. So he was not stoned as a form of death, although that might have been the intention. In most cases, he was run out of town by having rocks thrown at him. That's another thing to bring up with this particular passage. It doesn't just limit itself to the Old Testament. This applies to the apostles as well. What about sawed apart? That some were sawed apart. Do you read anywhere in your Old Testament of someone being sawed apart as a result of their faith or as being a faithful servant of God? Well, no, you don't read that in the Old Testament, but you do read it in pseudepigraphical literature. So pseudepigraphical means written by someone else claiming that it was written by the person that it claims to be written by. Boy, that's a mouthful. It would be as if I was writing a letter claiming to be Cindy, but I'm obviously not Cindy. Right? Pseudo means a lie. So pseudepigraphical is a false writing. This document dates between 70 and 170 A.D. So around the time of the fall of Jerusalem to the time of the early church after the New Testament. But it seems to obviously be familiar enough to the author of Hebrews to use it. It's a document called the Assumption of Isaiah. And in that document, we read the story of how Isaiah died. Now, whether or not it's true, no one can say. What we can say is that the author of Hebrews was familiar enough with it and trusted it enough to act as if it was true. And so maybe we could say, since it's included in Scripture, there might be truth to it. But the story goes that Isaiah was running from the evil king Manasseh. And Manasseh caught up to him, and Isaiah hid himself in a cedar tree. So think about a hollowed out tree. Isaiah hid himself in it. And Manasseh saw that Isaiah was in this tree, and so Manasseh commanded that the tree be cut down. Now there's two versions of this story that come up in the Talmud, which dates later than the Assumption of Isaiah. One story says that as they began to saw the tree down, when the saw touched the lips of Isaiah, that God took Isaiah, that Isaiah died. The other story says that as they sawed, they literally sawed into the body of Isaiah and they saw blood running out from the tree. Now, the point of that, first of all, is to show you where this legend comes from, if we want to call it legend. Maybe if since it's included in the inspired Scripture, there might be truth to it. But it's a pretty grotesque way to die, isn't it? It's pretty rough. I mean, look at all these. Mocking, floggings, chains, imprisonment, stones, sawed apart, murdered with the sword. And then it ends, verse 37 ends with their physical appearance. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins. Now, why is that important? What was clothing traditionally made out of in the ancient world? It wasn't sheepskins and goatskins. Made out of the same stuff that our clothes are made out of: cotton, linen, and wool, for the most part. Now, the law of Moses prohibits the mixing of those materials, but you would walk around in cotton, linen, or wool for the most part. So when John the Baptist is described, he's described as wearing what? Camel's hair and a leather belt. Camel's hair was not a way to describe the color of his overcoat like some of us gentlemen would go and get a camel-colored overcoat. He was wearing a leather coat, right? And he had the leather belt. So why is that important? Well, it describes to us that those who served as prophets, like John the Baptist and others of the Old Testament, renounced those worldly things to the point of renouncing the traditional clothing like linen and cotton and wool. It was also the sign of a prophet to take up what's called the mantle, right? You take up the mantle. It's Elisha does this with Elijah. Elijah comes to Elisha and throws down his mantle, and Elisha picks it up. The mantle was like this big overcoat, this leathery overcoat. And it was a sign of the prophet. They were destitute, afflicted, and ill-treated, and the world was not worthy of them. It's a powerful statement. They wandered in deserts, mountains, caves, and openings in the earth. I think particularly here about Elijah, when Elijah is running from Jezebel in 1 Kings 19, and he goes to the caves, and he says, I alone am left. Woe is me, right? The poor, pitiful prophet Elijah. And prior to that, Elijah had spent time, I believe it's in chapter 18, it might be chapter 17 of 1 Kings, where Elijah spends time at the brook and during the drought, and the ravens take care of him and feed him. And so the prophets didn't have an easy life. Right? So what does this tell us then about our present state, our reality as Christians in an unfriendly world? The first point here, I'm just going to read because it reads better than I can say it off the cuff. It says, the reality that faith does not always bring present deliverance implies a narrow association with endurance. We're not there yet. Lord willing, we'll get there tonight. Chapter 12 is all about endurance. The Christian life is hard. You are going to want to quit. Remember, the author of Hebrews is writing to an audience who wants to quit. They want to commit apostasy. They want to renounce their faith, and he's encouraging them not to hold on to your faith, hold on to your hope. And chapter 12 is going to show us that you can do that because you have a cloud of witnesses that are cheering you on. But it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? You're going to have to run with endurance. And then secondly, God's people must be able to see beyond the here and now while knowing that God will see us through the here and now. Here's the thing about the here and now. And I may have this on a point later. I don't remember if I do or not, but it bears saying here. If we as Christians can only see and think about what's happening right here, right now, and there's a lot to think about, right? I mean, the world in which we live, there's all kinds of stuff to talk about, all kinds of stuff to think about. There's a reason why long-form podcasts are so popular, right? Because it's easy to sit down and talk for 3 hours about stuff, and people are interested in that. But if all we can see is our present reality, then we're not people of faith. What we are materialists, because we can only see past what we can see, or we can only see up to what we can see. So when we talked about faith from chapter 11 and verse 6, chapter 11 and verse 1, faith is the ability to take a promised reality and act as if it is our present reality. Right? Faith makes the future present. So God's promise to us is you're going to be in heaven with me. You're going to be with me for eternity. Don't worry about the world. I've overcome the world. Right? That's God's promise to us. And yet we don't act as if that promise is our present reality. And that's what the author of Hebrews is trying to get us to do. Look at the people who we study about, who are real people, who had real challenges. These are real stories. It's not a Bible story, it's a biography. We read a biography of these people. And what the author is ultimately going to tell us in chapter 12 is if they could do it, you can too. Verse 39 and 40 will end chapter 11. And it says, all these were commended for their faith, yet they did not receive what was promised. For God had provided something better for us, so they would be made perfect together with us. Now that last phrase is very, very difficult to interpret, and I don't think I have a good interpretation for it, so I'm going to rely on a great commentator in just a minute to interpret that for us. But all these were commended for their faith. Now think about this. Think about the list of individuals in chapter 11 that we looked at. Started with Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. The majority of the names I just mentioned, and especially the names in that rapid fire sequence. Let me turn to my Bible here and find the exact verse. Let's see. Verse 32. What more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Now, the author of Hebrews says that these were commended for their faith. You know what? Every name I just read, I could tell you a terrible story about. That's included in Scripture. Samson was a womanizer, a partier, and a drunk. He violated every part of the Nazirite vow that he had taken. And yet the author of Hebrews calls him a man of faith. Gideon was a crybaby. Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press. You do not thresh wheat in a wine press. You press wine in a wine press. He was hiding from the enemy. And then when God commissioned him, he asked for a sign. God gave him the sign. And then he asked for another one. And then Moses, we're studying Exodus on Sunday mornings when I preach, and we've seen Moses fail time and time again. Right? Moses didn't want to go to Egypt. He gave every excuse in the world why he couldn't go. And yet the author of Hebrews calls him a person of faith. So these were all commended for their faith, but they didn't receive what was promised. Prime example, case in point, Abraham. God told Abraham, if you leave your homeland, if you follow me, if you do what I say, I will make you into a great nation. I'll bring you to a land and I'll give you descendants. The Abrahamic covenant is twofold. One for land, one for descendants. And Abraham got a son, but he didn't get descendants in the time of his life as numerous as the sands on the seashore and the stars in the sky. And Abraham only owned a burial plot. It's the only piece of land he ever owned. So they all were promised something, but they died without having received the fullness of the promise. That's what faith is. Faith drives us to the point where we trust God regardless of what comes, because we know that God is going to ultimately fulfill His promise, whether it's in our lifetime or not. God has provided something better for us so that they would be made perfect together. How is it that they, in this context, the people of the Old Testament, would be made perfect together with us? How does that happen? Well, we need to read this in a different way than what we're perhaps tempted to. We need to understand that from the perspective of the author of Hebrews, that community of faith and the present community of faith live in continuity with each other. So think about it in this way. Why is it that we as 21st century Christians are so, what can we say, are so keen on keeping the first century pattern of worship? Why is that? It's because we live in continuity with them, right? Because we say, well, what they did is still applicable for us today. So we view ourselves with them. And the author of Hebrews encourages us to view ourselves in continuity with the people who live by faith in the Old Testament. Something that we don't really do. We say, well, they're over there under the old law, we're over here under the new law. But there's commonality because faith is what maintains everything. I don't know if I'll have a chance to do this or not, but one night I do want to offer you maybe a perspective on Hebrews. Because Hebrews is really interesting. It's a Jewish document written by a Jewish guy to Jewish people about Jewish stuff. Now, obviously, there are Christian tones in there, but it's overwhelmingly Jewish. And the author talks about the Abrahamic covenant quite a lot, but never once talks about the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. You would think that if it's a Jewish person writing to Jewish people about Jewish things, that would come up. But the author does write quite a lot about faith. And faith does the same purpose that the sign of the covenant does in the Abrahamic covenant. We might look at that some other time. So, I want to read to you from James Thompson. He wrote a commentary on Hebrews. James Thompson is a professor at Abilene Christian. He's a member of the church and a very good scholar on the book of Hebrews. If you're looking for a commentary, his commentary on Hebrews is very good. He says, God's plan will only be fulfilled when the faithful people throughout the ages reach the heavenly homeland together. I think that is certainly what the author of Hebrews is trying to get us to see. That they were progressing towards a place, we are progressing towards a place. Right? Now in chapter 12, we're going to have a comparison of that. Like Moses and the Israelites are progressing toward a promised land, we are progressing towards the city of God. And we're going to use that as an example. Okay, that brings us then to chapter 12. Look at the first 3 verses here. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, we must get rid of every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and run with endurance the race set out for us, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set out for him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Think of him who endured such opposition against himself by sinners, so that you may not grow weary in your souls and give up. Well, that might just be the theme of the entire book. We have seen, and I'm not saying Paul wrote Hebrews, but Hebrews kind of lays out how Paul's letters lay out. You have a theological section at the front, and you have a practical section at the end. And the practical section comes as a result of the theological section. So the book of Ephesians lays out this way. Chapters 1 through 3, theological. Chapters 4 through 6, practical. We have seen in the book of Hebrews how Jesus is better. That's often what people say the theme of Hebrews is. Jesus is better. He's better than the sacrifices. He's better than the priesthood. He's better than the angels. He's better than the law of Moses. He's better than the Abrahamic covenant. He's just better than everything, right? He's the Old Testament to its fullest. And we can study that in Hebrews and we can think, great, now I'm a theologian. Let's write a book. But what does that mean for me as a Christian? Where's the so what? This is the so what. Therefore, y'all know our rule of therefore. When you see therefore, you have to ask, what's the therefore? Therefore links what has come previously to what I'm about to say. If what I've said is true, what I'm about to say is true because what I've said is true. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, this term cloud of witnesses is used often in ancient literature to refer to the people who attend sports events. They sit up in the stands and they cheer for the athletes. So, I don't know how many sports fans are in this room. I assume several. Imagine going to the Super Bowl, being the quarterback for one of the teams and having half of the stadium yelling out your name. Right? That's what a cloud of witnesses is. And I like the term cloud too because, maybe you've left early in the morning when there's a dense fog advisory and it's really thick around you and you can't see past it. This cloud of witnesses, the idea is that these people that we've read about, who are dead and gone and have been dead and gone, are still rooting for you. They're cheering you on. So what do? Well, because we have the cloud of witnesses, we must get rid of every weight and the sin that clings so closely. Well, what's the weight and what's the sin in this particular context? Well, on the one hand, we have the temptation to commit apostasy, right? Chapter 6 and chapter 10. Apostasy is the public, intentional denial of the faith, renouncing the faith. It's not just, well, I just sinned and I'm sorry and I need to get my life right and I stumbled and there, that's not what apostasy is. Apostasy is the leaving of the faith. I cannot imagine the amount of spiritual stress that must have been on these churches. Living in a time when the emperor of Rome, and we argued that the congregation here to whom is being written is in Rome. Now, others believe they might be in Jerusalem or elsewhere. I think Rome is a good option. Couldn't imagine being a Christian in Rome in the first century. When the emperors want to kill you, when it's illegal to meet, and if you're caught, you die. I mean, there's no judicial system, right? If you're caught, you die. It's no wonder they wanted to renounce their faith. That's a pretty weighty thing. It's always bothered me when people want to talk about their issues, talk about their problems, and sometimes it's a temptation for us to say, well, at least you're not dealing with this. Like, well, maybe not, but what I am dealing with is pretty important to me. I love that the author of Hebrews doesn't say, well, at least you're not one of the prophets of the Old Testament. Look how bad it was for them. What the author of Hebrews says is, hey, let me show you an example where somebody went through something very similar to what you're going through. If they could go through it in faith and know that God's going to take care of them, how much more do you think God's going to take care of you? That's encouraging. And then he says at the end of verse 1, run with endurance the race set out for us. Endurance might be the entire theme of chapter 12. Run with endurance. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Paul will liken the Christian life to that marathon. When you run those marathons, many of you in here have done that, you know. You have to pace yourself, that's true. You can't just start out of the gate. I think, I've told you this before, I think that's why the Lord's church loses people. Because we get them in the water and they come out and they're just on fire and they start sprinting. And then they get burnt out and disappointed. While we don't want to hinder that or put out that flame, we might just not want to get that flame so close to the gasoline. Instead, we might want it to burn some cardboard boxes first, maybe some kindling. Run with endurance. Well, if you don't have endurance, you're going to wear out. You're going to get sore. You're going to want to stop. And those of you who do run in here, you know I'm right when I say this. If you're running and you're running long distance and you're pacing yourself and you start getting those side stitches and your knees start hurting, your feet start hurting, you have trouble breathing, what's the worst thing you can do in that moment? Stop. Right? If you stop, it's game over. Well, the same is true for being a Christian. Run with endurance. How do we do that? We keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. Growing up on the farm, Dad would often put me or my brother on the tractor to bush hog. And I learned this, I don't know if I learned this from Dad or if I learned it from my granddad, but I learned that if you're on a tractor, if you look immediately in front of you and you're focused immediately on what the tractor is about to go over, your lines will be crooked. But if you pick a spot at the end of the field and you look at that spot and you go to that spot, your lines will be straight every time. So keeping your eyes fixed on Jesus, in Proverbs chapter 4, we get a very similar statement, and I'll see if I can find this. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 25, 26, and 27. Let your eyes look directly in front of you. Let your gaze look directly straight before you. Make the path for your feet level, so that all your ways may be established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Turn yourself away from evil. Growing up, we had a team of miniature donkeys. Their names were Dominic and Silas. And I love those donkeys. They kicked the fire out of me. But I didn't love them all the time, but I loved them most of the time. They pulled a wagon. So you got to think, these aren't like big donkeys. These are miniature donkeys, right? We'd hook them up to this wagon. They would pull my dad, my mom, me, and my brother. And we would take them in parades. We did the Uncle Dave Macon Days parade. We did the Bedford County Christmas parade. We do all that stuff. Those two little donkeys just going all over creation. And those of you who have ever done work with mules or horses or donkeys with carts, when you put the bridle on, those bridles have leather blinders on them. And the point of those blinders is so the animal won't look to see all the distractions. It'll keep its eyes fixed on what's ahead. Right? Christians have got to put on some spiritual blinders. There's a lot to distract us in this world. And we often look to the right or to the left or up or down whenever the text tells us, keep your gaze fixed. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Look straight ahead. And that's what the text says here. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. And Jesus is called here the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. Anybody actually have your Bibles open and looking with me at your text, or are you just looking at the screen? It's fine if you're just looking at the screen, but I want to do some translation comparison if I can. Does anyone say he is the leader instead of pioneer? This would be verse 2. Keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of our faith. Does anyone say that at all? Everyone says pioneer? Founder. Okay, same difference. This comes from a Greek word that in one sense could mean the head or the leader or the founder. It could mean a pioneer in the sense that it's never been done before and this is the first person to do it. It could also be used of like a prince as a ruling title. So the question is, well, what best fits here? And there's arguments for both. Some translate this as he is the pioneer in this, and that's what this text has, the New English translation, as in he is the beginner. And I think the word founder would imply that. This makes a lot of sense in the context of Hebrews. If you start in chapter 1 and work your way through, this makes a lot of sense. If you're looking more narrowly at just this verse, the term leader makes a lot of sense. So what's the difference? Not much, other than it's just important here that we see that this is one of the only times in Scripture where Jesus is, what can we say, depicted as maybe the inventor of something. And we're kind of guilty of that. We're guilty of both. We're guilty of, on the one hand, saying that Jesus is the beginner, he's the founder of the church, and that Christianity is different from any other religion that's ever existed. And on the one hand, that's true. But then we're also guilty of saying, well, Jesus fulfilled the law of Moses and thereby made it obsolete. And by fulfilling the law of Moses, the church, and Paul will even argue this, that the church, we're all sons of Abraham and heirs to the promise. And so you have that Abrahamic theme, that Israelite theme. And so we're spiritual Israel. There's not really an issue there with either one of those. Both are true simultaneously. And it's just interesting here, this is one of the few places where Jesus is actually the instigator. If you take that definition of that word can mean a number of different things. The word perfecter here, does everybody's Bible say he is a perfecter of our faith? Finisher. Okay, that's interesting. The word here could mean perfect. It could mean finished. It could mean complete. So for example, when Jesus is hanging on the cross, one of the last things he says is, "It is finished." Right? Well, does he really say that? Arguments have been made, and translations, I think, are going to change, where they're saying, he's not saying it's finished, as in my life is finished or the crucifixion is finished. But because that word can also mean complete, he's saying it is completed. The mission of God has been completed. Now you get that with the word finished, it is finished. But the mission of God that God started, that God told about, that was prophesied in Genesis chapter 3, that all of humanity had been waiting for to that moment. Ooh, that adds a lot of weight to that verse, doesn't it? That it's completed. So he is the pioneer and perfecter. Well, what else could we say? We could just as easily say he is the beginning and the end of our faith. What are the two terms for Jesus in the book of Revelation? He is Alpha and Omega. Do you know why that's so important? Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, the beginning and end. Right? He is the beginner and ender of our faith. For the joy set out for him, he endured the cross. Wait a minute. I thought the cross was painful, right? And shameful. And yet here it says, for the joy set out for him. Can there be pain? Can there be joy in suffering? Sure there can. Ask any woman who has had a child. Right? I just finished listening to a book. I do not recommend it. I didn't think it was a great book. But it's by a guy named Peter Kreeft, and it's a book on suffering. And he argues that the reason we suffer is so that we can experience joy in suffering. That's an interesting perspective. Here's the thing. No book will ever tell you why we suffer. There's no satisfactory answer to why we suffer. Even Job didn't get a satisfactory answer. Job's answer was, I'm God and I'll do what I want. Thank you very much. But there can be joy in suffering. So for the joy set out for him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Right? The law of Moses says, curses every man who dies on a tree. So not only is it shameful for him to die that death as a Jew, every time I say this, somebody meets me in the back and wants to argue about it, which is fine. Jesus probably died naked. And as a Jew, it would have been incredibly shameful to be naked publicly. They put a crown of thorns on his head, resembling that of a king. I read a very interesting paper not too long ago. I'm sorry, I'm sounding like a nerd. The artistic depiction of the crown that we often see is like a halo. This paper argued that if you look at crowns from that part of the world in that time, it was a lot like the king and queen crown of England. And so it would have had a covering. And so what they did is they reworked the rendition of the crown where it's more like a bowl. Now think about this. If it's a crown of thorns, it's not just cutting into the sides of his head, it's being pressed down on top. And every part of his cranium is feeling a thorn. And those thorns are causing blood to shed. And if you've ever had a cut on your head or your ear or something like that, your head bleeds quite a lot. The entire crucifixion was public humility for Jesus. Did it hurt physically? Yes. Did it hurt spiritually and emotionally? Yeah. No wonder Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's not because of the pain of the nails in his hands. That certainly hurt and is scourging. I mean, we don't need to ignore that. But everything about the crucifixion was intended for shame. By the way, you know what they did with you when you died as being crucified on a cross? They left you there, traditionally. Now, Jesus was taken down because it was Passover. But they would leave you there so when people were coming into the city, they would see you hanging there. Most people hung on a cross for about 3 to 5 days. Jesus had lost so much blood by the time he got on the cross from being scourged that his death was somewhat quicker. Well, it's considerably quicker, but still a long time to hang and suffer. So it says he disregarded its shame and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. That's a place of prominence. It's a place where a king sits. So we have seen Jesus now in 3 roles. Well, 4 roles. We have seen him as sacrifice. We have seen him as priest, we have seen him as prophet, and we now see him as king. All of those are true simultaneously. And we've seen that play out in the book of Hebrews. Verse 3, think of him who endured such opposition against himself by sinners, so that you may not grow weary in your souls and give up. So we started in verse 1, think about the cloud of witnesses. Chapter 11, here's your entire witness list. These are the people surrounding you, cheering you on. And when you feel like giving up, just think about Jesus. Think about what he went through. And I think there's good reason to say, even though things will get worse before they get better, that's a biblical promise, we will still not have it as bad as Jesus did. And it's a great promise for us that as Jesus was the one who ran the race first and finished the race, the race is not finished at death. The race is finished in the resurrection. Jesus is the firstborn of the dead, right? Resurrection to never die again. Others were raised from the dead, but resurrection to never die again. Jesus ran the race that we are now running. And so what do? We do what Peter tells us. 1 Peter chapter 2, I believe it's verse 15 maybe. It's at the end of 1 Peter 2. Where Peter says that Christ left us an example so that we can follow in his footsteps. Those are some pretty big footsteps to follow, and yet the charge is there. But thank goodness we have the example to do it. I can't tell you how many times I do something at the house where I have to pull up YouTube to show me how to do it. I'm so glad and so thankful for YouTube, because it gives me an example. Well, I've got the greatest example right here. It tells me how to do everything I need to do. When people keep asking me, are you nervous to be a father? Yes. But I also have the best instruction manual ever made. Am I nervous about it? Yes. Am I worried about it? No. And the same should be true for all of us in whatever stage of life we're in, whatever comes. Come what may. Here's the instruction manual.